From the Cronkite studios in downtown Phoenix, this is Cronkite News.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Cronkite News on Arizona PBS. I'm Cynthia Esqueda. Cronkite News is the only news organization in the state with a dedicated Washington, D.C. bureau. Tonight, a look at some of the biggest issues for Arizona being decided in our nation's capital.
U.S. veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan planted thousands of flags in the nation's capital this morning to commemorate the thousands of vets who commit suicide every year. Cronkite News reporter Imani Stevens is live in Washington, where she heard from survivors and family members of those victims.
The volunteers started planting flags at 6 a.m. and it took close to 5 hours to place 5,500 flags in the shadow of the Washington Monument, each flag representing one veteran or active service member who has died by suicide this year.
Every last one of us had a friend or a family member's name in mind as we planted these flags. Some of us standing here could have been one of these flags.
A survey by the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America found that most of its members have been touched by the suicide of someone they know.
Our latest member survey shows that 65% of our membership knows somebody who has attempted suicide, and 58% know somebody who's died by suicide.
The most recent findings by the Department of Veterans Affairs found that there were 17.5 suicides for every 100,000 veterans in the U.S. in 2016. In Arizona, the veteran suicide rate was 44.1. In 2016, more than twice as high as the national rate. Melissa Bryant, who was stationed at Fort Huachuca, says it touches all ages.
Even though the Vietnam era is the largest cohort by sheer volume of numbers for those who are dying by suicide, there's an alarming rate of those 18 to 34, the post-9/11 generation. We're dying at a much faster rate by suicide than was previously recorded.
Patrice Sullivan saw the struggle in her high school sweetheart after he served from 2000 to 2004.
When he got home in 2004, he was really struggling. He just felt like he didn't fit in. And then 9 months later, he died by suicide. And so March 13, 2005.
Planting these flags gave Sullivan a moment of reflection.
Every time I plant a flag, I said his name out loud because I think it's important to still say their name. Today, I was frustrated, but I was hopeful, because you have to put yourself out there for things to change.
The IAVA says 20 veterans or active duty military commit suicide every day.
For the last 17 years are coming home and they're struggling with transition. And we're finding that active duty troops are struggling even while they're still on active duty. So we must have a whole of government solution to this epidemic.
Today's flag planting was just one event in a week of activities designed to highlight the issue of veteran suicide. After planting 5,520 flags on the National Mall, the volunteers were scheduled to head to Capitol Hill to lobby with members of Congress. Live in Washington, Imani Stevens, Cronkite News.
Reactions in Washington have been predictably swift and strong, with groups both opposing and praising Trump's goal of putting the brakes on birthright citizenship. Cronkite News reporter Lillian Donahue is talking with experts in the nation's capital about Trump's proposal.
The president's words have yet again created a buzz here in the nation's capital.
A person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits.
The main question is whether Trump's notion of dissolving birthright citizenship is even constitutional. Kenneth Romero with the National Caucus of State Legislators says no, calling it a strategic move by Trump.
But more than that, is an attempt to have an impact on the upcoming midterm elections by instilling fear in some groups and instilling anger in other groups.
Despite this, researcher Matthew O'Brien with the Federation for American Immigration Reform says that Trump's plan is entirely possible.
Overall, I think it makes a lot of sense. So one of the things the president as the chief executive can do is issue an executive order telling executive agencies how they are to interpret that provision of law. Now that, of course, is subject to interpretation by the courts, but it clearly is something that falls within the power of the executive.
Trump's remarks come during a tumultuous week on immigration policy, with thousands of troops heading to the border to stop a migrant caravan that the president says could, quote, infest the United States. The Migration Policy Institute opposes Trump's plan to weaken birthright citizenship and warns the president that reinterpreting the 14th Amendment could actually backfire.
MPI has estimated that doing this would increase the population of authorized immigrants inside the United States by anywhere from 5 to 13 million by 2050.
Now, any proposal by Trump on birthright citizenship is sure to be challenged by the courts, but Pierce does say that a conservative majority on the Supreme Court could have the final say. In Washington, Lillian Donahue, Cronkite News.
President Donald Trump criticized Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan today on Twitter for not supporting his motion to end birthright citizenship. Ryan says he agrees with the president about getting to the root of unchecked illegal immigration, but claims you cannot end birthright citizenship with an executive order.
Well, you obviously cannot do that. You cannot end birthright citizenship with an executive order. We didn't like it when Obama tried changing immigration laws via executive action, and obviously as conservatives, we believe in the Constitution.
Trump's tweet said, quote, Paul Ryan should be focusing on holding the majority rather than giving his opinions on birthright citizenship, something he knows nothing about. Our new Republican majority will work on this, closing the immigration loopholes and securing our border.
For some Arizona residents, birthright citizenship is more than a legal theory. It's how they define themselves as U.S. citizens born in this country, although their parents may have been here illegally at the time. Ian Solomon and our Washington bureau caught up with one such citizen from Arizona.
When Arizona native Francisco Fernandez heard about President Trump's proposal to do away with birthright citizenship, he reflected on what citizenship has given to him.
So I'm able to pursue my academic careers and my academic goals and pursue so many things that only a citizen can benefit from.
As an Arizona State University alum who now works in Washington, Fernandez worries the opportunities afforded to him will be denied to future generations if Trump succeeds.
Because had it not been for citizenship, I would not have the opportunities that I have now, and I'm able to chase what I want my American dream to be, and I can't imagine other kids not having that.
He may not have to imagine that after all, says immigration policy expert David Beer of Cato Institute.
Because the policy is legally dubious, it's doubtful that anyone should really be concerned about this policy proposal, because it is very likely that it would be struck down by the courts.
Congressman Ruben Gallego agrees, tweeting yesterday that birthright citizenship is literally in the Constitution. This is nothing more than a typical Trumpian bluster. Whether it's legal or not, Beer says the proposal would not be in the country's best interest.
You want to create a unified country where everyone who lives there and grows up there knows that their identity is wrapped up in the success of America. And that's something that would be lost if we moved away from that policy.
And that sense of identity is something Fernandez holds close.
And I just can't imagine what my life would be like if I wasn't a U.S. citizen.
While there has been debate, no progress has been announced towards President Trump's proposal. In Washington, Ian Solomon, Cronkite News.
An overburdened Department of Homeland Security released hundreds of migrant families from detention centers in southern Arizona this weekend. And senators pressed Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen for details on those releases at a hearing this morning. Cronkite News reporter Charlene Santiago is in our Washington bureau, and she was at the hearing this morning.
The hearing touched on everything from cybersecurity to terrorism. But Arizona Senator Jon Kyl had a question that hit much closer to home.
What can we tell the community?
The community he was referring to is Yuma, one of several where he said officials and citizens were taken by surprise recently when hundreds of immigrant families were released to local nonprofits. DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said there are simply too many immigrant families to process and not enough space. But Kyl was looking for assurances for local residents.
If these reviews are not being done because the numbers are too overwhelming, then the fact is that people in Yuma are going to be threatened to some extent by an enormous number of illegal entrants into the country, and some of whom may not be making asylum claims.
Prior to this weekend, DHS would have helped migrants who were waiting for a hearing by reaching out to family members already in the U.S. and finding transportation. With recent surge in families, DHS has turned to local nonprofits to help the immigrant families while they wait for their hearing. Nielsen said the families have to be released to obey a court ruling that limits detention of children to no more than 20 days. The solution, she says, is on Congress.
My department will continue to ask Congress to pass legislation to clarify that families can be detained until they are removed. If they have an asylum claim, they can be detained until we can adjudicate that asylum claim.
But while Nielsen pressed Congress, protesters who walked out at the start of her testimony said DHS needs to work harder to reunify the children it has in custody who haven't seen their parents since they were separated at the border.
I'm here as a mom. I'm here as someone who cares deeply about the millions of children who were separated from their parents.
While the families are no longer in custody, they're also not completely free. ICE officials say these families are being paroled and supervised, and they've all been given an immigration court date. In Washington, Charlene Santiago, Cronkite News.
Stories of sexual assault command the headlines lately, but for some former athletes who were abused by their coaches, the story's always with them. Cronkite News reporter Ian Solomon explains.
I want to be able to say it's difficult to let go. Honestly, the truth is I think it's impossible to let go.
She and Thompson joined 11 other former athletes, all women, who were pressing Congress to better protect young athletes from abuse by predatory coaches and trainers. Abuse that began at age 15 for Thompson and continued for years.
He even went as far as putting a dog collar around my neck, forcing me to swim, while he walked down the pool deck beside me holding the leash.
Even if they are strong enough to report their abuse, these women say little is done to protect victims, often forcing them out of sports they love. For Thompson, that meant quitting the ASU swim team to escape abuse that began years earlier.
That was the only way I could get rid of him, was to quit swimming, and I was at Arizona State. I lost everything.
Jocelyn said she too was forced to leave the sport she loves, and that's why she's here to speak out.
It's too broken to be a part of, and that's why we're here. That's why I'm sharing my story that's shameful and embarrassing, because I know that it's worth having some change.
Thompson is now a lawyer who deals with sexual assault cases, but says Congress needs to help.
Congress needs to change the Sports Act to protect children instead of the coaches who abuse them.
While Jocelyn carries the pain of her abuse, she also carries positive memories of her career and has hope for the future.
Walking in through the stadium, wearing the USA on my back and hearing, USA, USA, and that roar still is something that resonates like deep, deep, deep in my heart. So I know that there is a hope, but things have to change.
In Washington, Ian Solomon, Cronkite News.
It's been a tense couple of weeks in Washington as Senate Republicans and Democrats spar over Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, whose nomination is on hold while the FBI investigates sexual assault allegations against him. The senators behind that investigation, Arizona Republican Jeff Flake and Delaware Democrat Chris Coons, came together today with a message of bipartisanship, as Daniel Pearl reports from our Washington bureau.
In their first public appearance since brokering a bipartisan deal last week, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware and Senator Jeff Flake repeated their insistence that Washington needs more bipartisanship, like what was on display in the Judiciary Committee last week. A standing ovation greeted the two senators as they walked onto the Atlantic Festival stage today. They said rampant partisanship threatens not just Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination, but the court itself.
That's how it has worked for us to cede so much authority and give so much power to the Supreme Court, because people still have faith. If that faith is gone, then heaven help us.
Theirs was one of several discussions on the danger polarization poses to American democracy, a danger Flake saw up close when a gunman opened fire at a Republican practice for last year's congressional baseball game.
Why us? Why here? How can someone look on a field at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball, trying to relive their youth, and see the enemy.
Flake said the more partisan nature of politics made him realize he could not run a re-election campaign this year, but Coons, who is up for re-election in 2020, said it gave him all the more reason to run again.
If the Senate doesn't work, our Constitution, our republic, our nation doesn't work, I cannot abandon this post. If the people of Delaware will have me, I'll do it again. And I want to tell you,
while avoiding saying whether the FBI investigation would sway his vote one way or the other, Senator Flake did say he hopes it will wrap up by the end of the week and that it finds facts. In Washington, Daniel Pearl, Cronkite News.
The National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials came out with its forecast today for voter turnout. It's predicting that as many as 7.8 million Latino voters could go to the polls across the U.S. And Naleo said it expects turnout to be strong in Arizona as well. Charlene Santiago in our Washington bureau has more on the report.
Naleo says as many as 486 Latinos will likely turn out in Arizona, a number they say could be much higher if Latinos in the state didn't continue to face obstacles in registering and voting.
We can't just sit by and watch while elections happen without doing all we can to ensure Latinos participate and make their voices fully heard.
More Latinos are expected to vote this year in Arizona than in the last midterms in 2014, as many as 13% more. But Naleo estimates that 80,000 eligible Latino voters in the state could be affected by voter ID laws.
This map presents the number of Latinos in each of these states that could be affected by these voter ID laws.
For those who are registered and ready to vote, however, there's another problem. They're being ignored by candidates.
So we're not seeing investment in the Latino electorate overall.
When it comes to campaign voter engagement, more than half of Latinos nationwide told Naleo that they have not been contacted by a candidate for this election.
The numbers don't lie. If 53% of Latino registered voters consistently, week after week after week after week after week, tell us that no one's talking to them, then something isn't happening.
But not every campaign agrees. National Democrats insist they are working closely with local campaigns to increase Latino engagement.
Our focus has been to invest in the grassroots efforts that are being done by the state parties, and we've done so in this election cycle, and I think we'll continue to do so moving forward.
And Vargas says there are plenty of issues that Latino voters are energized about if politicians will listen.
In terms of what more outreach means, it means hard work. It means knocking on doors. It means calling people. It means engaging them. It means listening to Latino voters and not assume that you know exactly what's on their minds.
Naleo says while immigration continues to be a top priority for this electorate, it's not the only one. Some of the other issues Latinos are looking to address include improving wages, creating more jobs, and lowering health care. In Washington, Charlene Santiago, Cronkite News.
When Congress gets back to work after the elections, one of the first items of business it could face is a new push to fund a border wall. Ian Solomon in our Washington bureau brings us the latest developments.
House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy says the proposed border wall is something the American people want and is a basic responsibility of the nation. That's why he's introducing his Build the Wall, Enforce the Law Act. But some wonder if the $23.4 billion price tag is realistic.
It was a rough estimate based on cost per mile, but didn't consider costs for specific projects and what those specific projects might total in costs.
Rebecca Gambler was talking about a Government Accountability Office report from August, back when the cost estimate was $18 billion for more than 700 miles of wall. The report said that estimate did not consider key elements.
You're building in mountainous terrain, or you're building in a remote region along the border, it will cost far more than simply the cost of the material.
Critics say there is no right price for the wall, but Andrew Arthur is not one of those critics.
Aliens who enter the United States illegally for work are competing against those most disadvantaged members of our society, and that we do those disadvantaged members of our society no service by allowing a huge influx of individuals to enter the United States illegally.
Economist Stan Voiger says the border wall may have an unintended effect, keeping illegal immigrants in rather than out.
It's because the harder you make it to enter the country illegally, the more tempting it becomes to remain in the U.S. for as long as you can.
Beer sees it in simpler terms.
A border wall will be a massive cost to taxpayers with almost no benefit in terms of security or other fiscal benefits.
The GAO says it's up to the Department of Homeland Security to prove the wall's worth, something the DHS has yet to do.
We continue to believe that DHS needs to do so, that CBP needs to establish those metrics to help inform their decision-making going forward, and also to help ensure that taxpayer dollars are being well spent.
In Washington, Ian Solomon, Cronkite News.
Experts are weighing in on the looming amount of student loan debt that often comes with attending college. And our Washington, D.C. bureau, Cronkite News reporter Imani Stevens is mapping out student debt across the state of Arizona and the nation.
I have to go to college and I have to take on debt to get there.
If there's any doubt about student debt, the third installment of this map shows that it is a national problem. The dark shades of purple indicates areas where up to 10% of students are delinquent, what they call extremely high rates of delinquency. And parts of Arizona are really purple.
When I'm taking a look at the Phoenix area, what I do see matches the things that we're seeing in other cities, which is that as income decreases, we're seeing higher levels of student loan delinquency and lower average balances.
They say a closer look at the map reveals an even bigger problem.
So as we were looking at the maps, you probably noticed two important things. That debt burden is highest in areas where employment rates are low, an indicator of weak labor market conditions. And debt burden is also high in zip codes that have high average loan balances.
And she said those are the people who need help the most.
It's people who are trying to climb to the middle class and really take advantage of higher education's promise that are also seeing it go unfulfilled.
The map breaks it down by those that identify as African American or Latino to show delinquency levels for those populations.
We're seeing that African American borrowers in particular are suffering from really high default rates. About 50% of African American borrowers are defaulting. Their rates are also extraordinarily high, even if they have a bachelor's degree.
There are solutions, Morgan says, and that may help people pay off their student loans.
We need to set some new bars that look at not just are you able to repay your debt, but are you able to actually be successful and do the things that we thought people ought to be able to do with a college degree.
In Washington, Imani Stevens, Cronkite News.
There was a bonus for some young trick-or-treaters today. They took the oath of citizenship as part of their Halloween celebration. Charlene Santiago brings us the story from our Washington bureau.
They were 35 children from 22 countries who came to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services office here to celebrate their new U.S. citizenship and at the same time celebrate a uniquely U.S. holiday. Not all the kids were as excited about the oath as they were about their costumes, but to their parents at least, it was more than just another Halloween.
Today was a special day for him that he became a U.S. citizen.
Together, they all vowed to serve and protect the country they call home, whether they were princesses or superheroes.
He's going to have the same values and he's going to get the same rights of what a U.S. citizen is all about. So he's going to have the same rights, which we, our generation, have worked for it.
Dima Rush is 10 years old and came to the U.S. from Iraq about 6 years ago. But today she was more than excited for both her Halloween costume.
I think it inspires me.
And for the ceremony.
Do you like it here?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's more safe and all, and it's protected by soldiers and all.
It was like any other Halloween. Parents were present, taking videos and pictures to share with those who couldn't be present.
My dad goes on rotation. Basically, right now he's in Kentucky. I was a little sad that he wasn't able to come to see me. And my mom's taking videos for him to see me. That's my favorite part.
The kids went trick-or-treating through the USCIS hallway after the ceremony, but that's not the only reason this will be an unforgettable Halloween for these families.
Well, for him, he was only 9 weeks old when we brought him home here, so this is the only home he knows of. So I'm just going to tell him this was a celebration of his homecoming.
In Fairfax, Virginia, Charlene Santiago, Cronkite News.
Some middle schoolers are taking their science projects to the next level, the national stage, that is. Our Cronkite News Washington Bureau reporter Ian Solomon caught up with one Valley 8th grader whose project is making waves in the nation's capital.
When Scottsdale middle schooler Akshaya Venkatesh saw how much food was being wasted after meals at her temple, she went looking for a solution. A solution she wants to put in the palm of our hand.
I thought I could incorporate an app and this food waste idea into one thing.
After attending a coding camp, that app became a reality. A pocket-sized solution to help communities across the world organize and distribute their leftover food items.
World hunger is a huge problem in the world right now. People don't realize what a big problem it is, and they just waste food. They just throw out food like it's nothing.
Akshaya's work landed her a spot as one of 30 finalists in the 2018 Broadcom Masters STEM competition, selected from more than 2,500 middle schoolers who applied. The finalists are here in the nation's capital presenting science, technology, engineering, and mathematics-focused projects that range from tennis ball sorters to solar-powered home ventilation systems.
We are really thrilled and proud of all of these young people who are trying to solve the world's most intractable problems.
While the competition emphasizes world impact, it's just as much about the students themselves.
You know, we hope as middle school students that events like this just give them the confidence to continue those passions into high school and beyond.
Akshaya plans to do just that.
Kids, they think that science fairs are stupid. Some kids think like, oh, how do you have time to do science fairs? If it can get you this far, like you should do it every year. And going from a school fair to coming here, I feel like it's kind of amazing.
The winners will be announced Tuesday night here in DC, with first place taking home $25,000. In Washington, Ian Solomon, Cronkite News.
That's it for Cronkite News tonight. Thanks for joining us. For top Arizona stories anytime, go to cronkitenews.azpbs.org.